I'm pleased to introduce Alberto Toscano, who teaches here in the Department of Sociology. His most recent book, called Fanaticism on the Uses of an Idea, came out in 2010, and explores the history of the pejorative perception of uncompromising politics in Western thought, tracing how the menace of extremist abstraction continues to determine our thinking about secularism, religion, and militancy. His book, Cartographies of the Absolute, which is co-authored with Jeff Kinkle on the aesthetics of contemporary capitalism, is coming out in 2014. He sits on the editorial board of the Journal of Historical Materialism and is the series editor of the Italian list of Seagull books. Please join me in welcoming Alberto Toscano.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Mark. Can you hear me fine?
Yeah.
Yeah? Good. So what I'll be speaking about this evening is part of the project that Mark already mentioned, this book called Cartographies of the Absolute. And I wanted to say a couple of words before I get down to the specific concern of my talk, which is the work of Harun Farocki, Trevor Paglen, and Allan Sekula, as it relates to the question of landscape and capitalism. I wanted to say a few words just about the context of the project. And this book, Cartographies of the Absolute, and the sentences stolen, like a few of the book's arguments from Frederick Jameson, comes from his, the preface to his book, The Geopolitical Aesthetic, published in the 1990s. And we borrowed it because it seemed to somehow capture and encapsulate a number of trends or tendencies in contemporary visual art, but also popular narratives, which evidenced an increasing concern with the question of the representation of the representability of contemporary capitalism. And Jameson in the 80s made a pretty famous and relatively influential intervention at a conference called Marxism and the Interpretation of Culture under the title Cognitive Mapping. And he suggested that our political and cultural predicament, which at the time he was more prone to calling postmodernism than he might be today, was one that was marked by an increasing disjunction between individual and collective experience, or indeed individual and collective perception on the one hand, and the systemic and structural causes that in one way or another shaped that experience on the other. So that somehow the real machinery, so to speak, of our social life was no longer something that was as open to perception or representation as it might have been, let's say, for the realist or naturalist novelist of the 19th century, writing about a principally national capitalism in which class stratifications, exploitation, and political causalities were in some sense visible. So there's this kind of problem, which is in part a problem about visibility and perceivability, but it's also, and that's why Jameson borrowed the term mapping from the urban planner Kevin Lynch from his book The Image of the City, there's also a question of what he called orientation. So that in some sense what there was a deficit of, Jameson proposed in the 1980s, was a capacity, a deficit of the capacity to orient ourselves individually and collectively around a social totality in some sense. So without belaboring that too much, the project kind of arose out of the in a sense, perception or the acknowledgement that somehow Jameson's characterization was still of interest, still in many ways valid, but that the political and aesthetic and economic landscape was a different one. And so in one sense, what we wanted to do was to test out more or less 25 years afterwards the validity of this kind of argument, which brings together the political problem of orientation, the socioeconomic problem of the logic or the causalities of capital, and the aesthetic problem of representability or perceivability, or indeed visibility of capitalism. And what I want to talk about today is to what extent a seemingly anachronistic aesthetic or art historical concern, the concern with landscape, can be seen to have, in the work of some recent authors, inflected or qualified this question of cognitive mapping or of the representability of capitalism. And to consider this by, in a very glancing and admittedly very preliminary way, by touching on the work of these three figures. Now, for those of you who are acquainted with the work of Farocki, Paglen, and Sekula, there are some obvious commonalities in form and method, so to speak. In particular, the centrality, I suppose, of, so to speak, the essay form to the way in which they present their research and their visual work. The fact that Sekula's photography, Paglen's artwork, Farocki's films are all, in a sense, presented in an, or often presented, not always, often presented in an essayistic and evidently research-like format. And that in many ways, there's a studied break with the compartmentalization between producing written texts and producing visual work. And in fact, certainly more in the cases of Sekula and Farocki, as I'll explain, these are visual works which are themselves acts of critique or criticism. So there's also no real and evident separation between the moment of art production and the moment of art criticism, I think. Certainly in works like Allan Sekula's Fish Story or Farocki's works on war. All of these are, in a sense, works that don't just produce images, but they work on, in and against many of the images that circulate regarding capitalism, and in the case of Farocki and Paglen, war. In the case of Paglen, as an aside, one could, I suppose, argue that he does, in a different way, at times tend to compartmentalize his work, in fact, producing texts which are essentially journalistic investigations or narratives on the one hand, and then self-standing works on the other. But I think viewed as a whole, there are still some interesting commonalities with the work of Farocki and Sekula, but we can perhaps talk about them later. But as I said, partly because these trends are rather broad and the work's very complex, I wanted to narrow down somewhat by focusing on this theme of landscape. And of course, as a starting point, the idea that landscapes are manufactured or man-altered is not a discovery of late capitalism or a discovery of postmodernity. It's something that has accompanied the whole art historical history of the landscape form. And in fact, you can easily encounter, both in art histories and intellectual and cultural histories. Elaborate treatments of how landscape played a critical role in the emergence, for instance, of certain conceptions of the modern property individual, the very subject of modern philosophy, the subject in Locke of both self-consciousness, but also, for those of you reading Locke's texts on history and politics, the subject of self-consciousness is also at another level the subject of property or possession, and it of course is also the subject of dispossession, of the very colonial processes of which Locke was a fairly significant ideologue. But in any case, if we turn, for instance, to the first systematic account of landscape painting in Europe, at least the first account according to Gombrich, Lomazzo's Trattato dell'arte della pittura, you find this treatment of landscape. And it's a treatment in which we can see already that, contrary to landscape being considered a domain of the simply natural or dehumanized, the landscape, the very first aesthetic formalization of the question of landscape in 1585 is already recognizes, or indeed foregrounds, its profoundly social character. Thus, Lomazzo writes about painters who have discovered various ways of setting about the description of landscape, including in these kind of endless and rather elaborate Baroque lists, privileged places where they show temples, consistories, tribunals, gymnasiums, schools, places of fire and blood with furnaces, mills, slaughterhouses, gallows and stocks, others bright with serene air, and so on and so forth. In many ways, one of the things that's curious about this inaugural formulation of the landscape is actually how indeterminate it is, in a sense, as a category. How varied or heterogeneous it is. I won't enter into more discussion of the early formulations of landscape, but I wanted to put this forward just to get a sense that the aesthetic debates and the artistic practices that foreground the man-altered character of the landscape, especially in the photography of the 60s and 70s, which I'll be mentioning in a moment, are by no means breaking with some idea of the landscape as natural. This, in a sense, indeterminacy of landscape, I suppose, could be seen in some of its much more recent uses, in the way that landscape is seen as a site for identifying the traces of social or political life. So one of the more, I suppose, one of the richer seams or veins of this approach can be found in the transfiguration of the landscape form in attempts to register the impact of war. For instance, in the work of Sophie Ristelhuber, or in that of Simon Norfolk, and others. And in fact, interestingly, both Ristelhuber and Norfolk play very much on the way in which, at the origins, in a sense, of photography as a form, the idea of the landscape as a aftermath of war, devoid of human presence, often devoid of human presence for the technical reason of the length of the exposures. The way that the painterly forms of landscape had been appropriated by photography, and the way in which their citation, for instance, in Ristelhuber's photography of Iraq, or Simon Norfolk's photographic work on Afghanistan, can can, in a sense, discern some of the traces of contemporary conflict in what seem to be spaces without conflict. But the kind of landscapes, this is, again, more by way of context, the kind of landscapes that I'm more interested in thinking about this evening are landscapes not so much of indeterminacy, or landscapes that can be read as traces of trauma or traces of conflict, but landscapes that are marked, in a sense, by something like indifference. And this is where I think the transformation of the landscape as an artistic or aesthetic form in light of the attempt to represent something, some key features of contemporary capitalism is of interest. This is the indifference of landscapes that are modular, repetitive, based on iteration, landscapes that are in some sense, to borrow a term from Marxist social theory, landscapes that are landscapes of real abstraction. So they are, in a sense, abstract landscapes, but they are landscapes that are really or concretely abstract to the extent that the homogenizing and standardizing logic of capitalism turns material and physical spaces into spaces of actual or real or concrete, depending on your terminology, abstraction. In this sense, I think the fact that landscape and the landscapes of industry, the landscapes of real estate, the landscapes of logistics turn into a prominent or even a central concern of art and photography in the 1970s is, in a sense, a matter of no surprise. If we follow the extent to which this is a very period in which precisely the really abstract character of the production of space under capitalism becomes also the concern of social theory, primarily, or at least most notably in the work of Henri Lefebvre and in his production of space. And this is the moment that one Italian Marxist theorist, Mario Tonti, referred to as the space of the social factoring, when the logics of standardization, Taylorism, Fordism, assembly line production and division of labor, which in the classical period of capitalism were thought of as taking place within the factory, are extruded onto the social terrain as a whole. And I think there's an argument to be made for the fact that much of the artistic production of the post-war period that is concerned with man-altered landscapes or built spaces is trying to respond to this transformation. And in popular culture, this concern with these new spaces, these new indifferent, alienated spaces is very visible in Italian neorealist and post-neorealist film. For instance, in the work of Antonioni, trying to grasp these novel spaces of novel built spaces that have wiped away, in many ways, the memory of a previously agrarian society, in the case of Italy, become really crucial. As an aside, many people made a lot of the fact that Antonioni was centering this film, Deserto Rosso, on the seemingly depopulated, vast, ominous, but nevertheless quite beautiful shots of factories and chemical refineries and so on in Italy, and they presented it as they experienced it as an attempt to represent alienation. And there's actually quite amusing curious interview with Antonioni, where he says that he'd been gotten all wrong. He was just describing the fact that this was the material and social reality, and that actually his film was a film showing the inability of certain individuals to adapt to it, but for him the adaptation was actually a good thing. So there's this particularly disturbed, neurotic woman who's at the center of the film that many people saw as representing the evils of neo-capitalism in Italy, and he just seemed to present in this interview as somebody who hadn't properly adapted to this new space. I bring that up actually because one of the curious things that is worth dwelling on about these visual or aesthetic concern with the landscape of a fully urbanized capital of a society undergoing what Lefebvre called the urban revolution. One of the motifs of this is actually the ambiguity of these transformations. The fact that the representation of these new spaces and these new landscapes often comes without an obvious critical valence, comes without an obvious judgment about the kinds of spaces that they are and what they augur for social experience and subjectivity. Now, the one moment that I wanted to think about initially here, the one aesthetic movement is the movement of what was referred to, based on a very successful and influential show, the new Topographics movement. This is a show from the mid-70s, which really crystallized a trend, especially within US photography, but I would also find different pendants and offshoots and parallels in Europe, to concern itself with, as the catalog for this new Topographic show went, the man-altered or the manufactured landscape. Landscapes typically devoid of human presence, but also concerned in one way or another with this infinite modularity, iteration, repeatability, and indifference of built or public space. This is a representation of landscape which is in many ways was willfully deadpan, affectless, seemingly devoid of moral or political judgment. And in fact, a lot of the debates around it, and I think a lot of the debates around similar trends in photography, were polarized precisely by this seeming attempt to just register the transformation of space and of the experience of built space in the 1960s and 70s. Importantly, most of these works were presented without, very much contrary to the works of Allan Sekula or the works of Paglen and Farocki, they were presented without, generally without accompanying textual material, without captions, and without necessarily any kind of guidance as to the political and aesthetic perspective that somehow the audience was entreated to take. Unlike the landscapes that art historians interested in the emergence of the landscape as the counterpart of this modern subject of science, property, and mastery, these are landscapes which, in a sense, are intentionally devoid or stripped of a kind of subjectivity that would oversee them. They are not, in any clear way, landscapes virtually possessed by a viewer or a spectator. In fact, if anything, they are very much driven by this crowding out of agency or of human presence by the built space itself. In a relatively well-known polemic against this new topographic school, which I'll deal with a little more in a moment, for this reason, Allan Sekula famously referred to this as the neutron bomb school of photography. So the idea that somehow this fantasy of depopulation, this fantasy of the annihilation of social life that would leave behind only the dumb traces of urbanization or of capital, like a neutron bomb that wipes away all biological life but leaves architecture perfectly immaculate behind. And Sekula's critique, in a way, was precisely a critique concerned with the place of abstraction in this work. And one of the things that he identified was the way in which the new topographics school was, in a sense, mesmerized or almost fascinated by these spaces that were really or concretely abstract, spaces that had been rendered geometric, repeatable, and modular by the banal requirements of real estate and building. So, but which the new topographic school presented in what were often very recognizable modernist modes of abstraction. So this is, in a sense, the problem that Sekula was pointing to, is that for reasons that are very mundane reasons about, maximizing profit on built spaces in urban areas, or strategies of suburbanization, or the logics of building business parks, etc., in the 1960s and 70s, the production of space in the United States had generated these spaces which the photographers were drawn to as spaces in which they could project their kind of modernist desires for depopulated, inhuman abstraction. So rather than providing a kind of aesthetic engagement with or critique of the production of these abstract spaces, they were, in a sense, for Sekula, to use a term that he uses repeatedly in his essays, they were spiritualizing them. So they were engaging what he thought was the problematic or dubious dimension of modernist attitudes in general, which was this attitude of sort of spiritualizing social life, rendering the abstractions produced by the banal workaday existence of capitalism into objects of contemplation. And thus, in a sense, rendering them opaque to any kind of critical or analytical gaze. In particular, by repeating the very thing that these spaces did, which was to evacuate any reference to labor or social life in general. So in depicting the suburb, the business park, in this affectless and spiritualized way, their link to bodily, physical, laboring activity and experience was sundered for in a sense for a second time. So in a sense, the critique was that the new topographics were just repeating the very activity that the production of those spaces was engaged in the first place. And so the critique, in a sense, was a very, was both, coming from Sekula, was both a quite sophisticated critique about the link between these forms and the legacies of modernism, but also a very pointed and polemical political critique to argue that somehow this aestheticization of the indifferent landscapes of contemporary capitalism was also in some way complicit with them. It was simply repeating and rendering into objects of contemplation this particular spatial practice. He referred to it in a 1970s essay as the mystifying translation of a site of production into a site of imaginary leisure. So the world of this man-altered landscape was a world, in fact, in which all man-altering, to use the rather gender terms, that all man-altering activity was somehow evacuated. No labor, no production, just the infinite expanse of beautifully or disturbingly or indifferently symmetrical built spaces. Sekula summarized this critique in the following terms when he spoke, and this is especially a critique of the photography of Louis Baltz, who was a key practitioner of this new topographic school. What he was critiquing was the production of a landscape possessed of humanly made features, which can be translated into the realm of a non-referential abstract geometry. The deployment of roads, trenches, city grids, and cultivated fields over the rectangular space of the image is lifted into a universe of spiritualized affect or simple enjoyment. So rather than finding artistic methods for excavating the way in which the appearance of these spaces was in some way linked to the rather complex logics, but also the lived experience of their production, this moment in the artistic aesthetic history of landscape was engaging in this action of transcendence, of spiritualizing the real abstractions of space produced under capitalism into abstractions that could be contemplated as signifiers without reference, and somehow as the fantasy that one now existed in a space that was in a sense almost a thoroughly modernist space, a space where abstract art was just, you know, your daily environment. Now, Sekula qualifies his argument, and it's interesting to actually read Louis Baltz's own reflections on his work. Because, of course, Baltz produced the work for, in many ways, social and political reasons not entirely dissimilar from those that drive Sekula's work. And Sekula himself at one point says that, to his credit, the ambiguity in Baltz's work between abstraction, between these photographs that seem to match high modernism, and the documentary mode, that this ambiguity was an ambiguity that was already present in the built environments. In some sense, Sekula also concedes that this isn't just a politically dubious or aesthetically problematic move, it's also the result of a real conundrum, of a real difficulty on the part of the photographer or the artist of finding the sources or the causalities behind this built space. And it's interesting to see how Baltz himself describes his own work in terms which are strangely much more political than the ones that were ascribed to him. He says one of the most, speaking about his, another one of his works, in fact, one subsequent to Sekula's critique, he says one of the most common views capitalist society takes of nature is among the most rigorous and most appalling, landscape as real estate. And in a sense, that's the, that's a recognition of what was really behind what was the sort of social context of this new topographics movement, especially with its concern, which was mostly about the US Southwest, Arizona, California, and so on, which was a particular moment in the history of urbanization, or rather suburbanization, and indeed speculative urbanization, of which, of course, the much more recent subprime mortgage crisis is a kind of distant effect. But this, so in one sense, you could say, well, the new topographics movement was trying to create within the history of the landscape as an artistic form a response or a way of registering the fact that landscape was now this, in some sense, this product of the profit and speculative logic of the real estate industry. Of course, there's a much more complicated story that involves the political and, in many ways, class and racial logic of suburbanization in the States, but we can leave that aside. And so continuing with that, Balt says that this view, the view of landscape as real estate, was a view of nature presented to him in Park City, which is the site of this project, and the viewpoint he showed in his photographs. And he says, to know that an apparently, and I think this grasps this question of real abstraction in space quite well. He says, to know that an apparently unbroken expanse of land is overlaid with invisible lines demarcating the pattern of future development is to perceive it in a very different way than one would otherwise. In some sense, you could say that Baltz was trying to make visible the fact that what was really determining not just the production of space, but the experience of space, the life of people in the areas in which he was photographing, was not something that was immediately available to the eye. It was the invisibility of these demarcations, the invisibility of these logics of real estate that in some sense could only tangentially or obliquely be registered in the photographs themselves. So he says that these divisions only coincidentally pertain to topography and are the arbitrary result of financial speculation, illustrates the casually rapacious disdain that our culture has of the natural world as such. This attitude holds all non-productive land as marginal. Nature is what's left over after every other demand has been satisfied. And I think another thing that this passage or this reflection of Baltz's indicates is this problem that I was mentioning at the beginning, which is a problem that Frederick Jameson tries to articulate in his discussion of cognitive mapping, which is this idea of a disjunction. A disjunction between embodied, perceptual, or even cultural experience and social causality. So that in some sense, the visible space is not a space that easily betrays or easily communicates the logic that lies behind it. Many years before these photographic debates, in some of the earlier interwar debates about realism in art and photography, German playwright Bertolt Brecht had famously made this argument that no longer could the photographic record of a factory really tell us anything anymore about the nature of production or of capitalism. So actually this question of disjunction, you could argue, is one that goes long antedates this debate in the 70s. This idea that somehow the representation or the perception of economic and social life does not convey its causes or its origins with any ease. That what might appear to be realism, what might appear to record lived or built or social space, might actually simply reiterate its opacity, the inability to orient ourselves within it. And you could argue that this opacity is really, in a sense, to give Baltz credit and perhaps to pause a moment before making the, in some ways quite legitimate critique that Sekula makes, that one of the things that the new topographics photographs, and indeed Baltz's own work, which I think is among the more interesting of the lot, does, is to thematize or to represent this opacity. And Baltz himself, in describing his experience of trying to photograph these new industrial parks in Southern California, these infinite tracts of boxes going all the way into the horizon, he famously said the real problem was that you're going around the space, and as he put it, you don't know whether they're manufacturing pantyhose or Megadeth, referring to the nuclear industry in California. And it's, in a sense, it's this invisibility or absence of causality of production and of labor, which is, in a sense, what's being thematized. And I think similar, there's a kind of continuity between these 70s debates and the way that in a more recent period, perhaps not so much the spaces of real estate, as in the new topographics, but the spaces of logistics, of containerization, circulation, and transport have been thematized in photographic and aesthetic schools, which bear a lot of pretty direct relationship to that of the new topographics. And I think the problems formulated by the critiques formulated by Sekula in the 1970s are ones that could also be of relevance to the work, for instance, of Edward Burtynsky. Now, it's kind of interesting that here you have a shift not just from real estate to logistics, from industrial parks to containerization, but you also have a difference in the, at least, nominal motivations for the work. Whilst Baltz and others were perhaps trying to map the new organization of capitalism, Burtynsky is principally concerned, at least in his explicit discussions of his work, with questions of ecology. And he famously refers to the origin moment of his work as this epiphany when he was going to photograph some sites, I think, of oil production in Canada, that he was driving in a car driven by petrol, made of plastic, to play, so he had this kind of epiphany that basically his whole photographic or aesthetic life was just this moment within the sort of infinite self-reflection of petrol and plastic, that the camera was made of plastic at the time, the film depended on petrol and so on and so forth, and that he was, in a sense, the problem of his, the problem of representation for him was the fact that the very tools of representing and the very act of representing were entirely internal to this kind of energy cycle. And I think what we can add perhaps to the critical remarks that Sekula makes about the new topographics when it comes to this most recent work is to think perhaps more pointedly about the ways in which this work too can serve, in a sense, to spiritualize abstraction. In one fairly obvious instance, to repeat or perhaps be complicitous with the complete disappearance or the seeming disappearance of labor, which is actually at the source of why container ports exist. Very amongst the reasons, very costly strikes and actions by stevedores and dockers, the need to separate the city from its port, the real estate logic of why docklands are better places to develop luxury apartments than they are to store bulk goods, and so on and so forth. Now, curiously, in the work of Burtynsky, which is supposedly work that is driven by this ecological, energetic concern, the energetic dimension of human labor and productivity is also, for different reasons and in different ways perhaps than in the new topographics, wiped from the scene, as it is, for instance, in his pictures of the building of the Three Gorges Dam or coal fields in China as well. So what you get here too, I think, following Sekula's criticism, a kind of spiritualization of economic abstraction. Now, up to here, I've been referring to debates that have to do, in a sense, primarily with the representability of capital, but I think it's interesting that certainly in the works of Sekula, Farocki, and Paglen, this question of representability and of visibility is also one that attaches very much to the discussion, or to the attempt to thematize warfare. And in fact, Sekula's perhaps most interesting or most one of his most important critical essays on the history of photography is precisely about war photography. Now, Sekula wrote a very important piece on what he called the instrumental image. And partly I wanted to focus on this because, as in the text that was circulated, I think there's something very interesting about a formulation that the French theorist Paul Virilio made, writing about war and cinema, in a book by the title "The Logistics of Perception." I think, in some sense, what Sekula, Farocki, and Paglen are interested in is something like the logistics of perception. That is to say, the way in which thinking about how to visualize or imagine production is also necessarily concerned with thinking about production of the images themselves, and thinking about logistics is also a concern with the logistics of the images themselves, their circulation, their production. Now, Sekula was writing this critical essay in the 70s when Edward Steichen, a crucial figure in American modernist photography, a show had been put on of Steichen's photographs, of Steichen's so-called war photographs. Now, during World War I, Steichen had been at the head, had been the overseer of aerial reconnaissance for US troops. And he created, in a sense, this is kind of Sekula's point, that actually Steichen wasn't photographing. It's not, in fact, clear that any of the pictures that were then shown as Steichen's aerial or military photography, or wherever his, he was, in a sense, a kind of bureaucrat or manager or foreman of this incredibly complex assembly line that, you know, in the moment of war was producing all of these photographs. And what Sekula wanted to do was precisely to shift our attention from this modernist artistic myth, which was the myth that somehow Steichen's photography was being, his own aesthetic was being expressed or reflected in these pictures, which for Sekula was kind of manifestly nonsense because they were produced by this sort of military factory, according to incredibly tight and fairly brutal division of labor. But then, in fact, what was interesting about this moment was not its spiritualized appearance as a kind of moment in the history of modernism, but rather the way that it revealed what he called the instrumental image. This is how he described the question of the meaning of these photographs, which, of course, the critics who were curating the show by Steichen wanted to present in light of the history of modernism and of modernist abstraction. He says, the meaning of a photograph consisted of whatever yielded to the rationalized act of interpretation. As sources of military intelligence, these pictures carried an almost wholly denotative significance. Few photographs, except perhaps medical ones, were apparently free from higher meaning in their common usage. They seem to have been devoid of any rhetorical structure. And here, I think, is where Sekula's work on the question of the instrumental image also foreshadows the really, in many ways, much more systematic and in its own way, I think, even more insightful work of Harun Farocki in what he calls operational images. The fact that if we look at the logistics of perception and if we consider the role of image making in wartime and warfare, what we encounter is a vast domain of images, which is a domain of images that are not to be seen. In fact, images which might not exist for anybody's actual viewing. And in his films, Farocki shows how in not just the domain of targeting and military intelligence, but also in the very use of image making and image recording practices in factories and spaces of production. There is a vast amount of images that are not images of contemplation, images whose purpose is visibility. So I think there's an interesting analytical move here precisely to separate the image from this explicit concern with visibility or representability. But for Sekula, what we encounter if we think of the instrumental image and if we think of photography and image making in terms of its production and circulation, in terms of what Sekula calls its traffic in these essays and what he calls it traffic in photographs, one of the things that we should be concerned with is not just its production, as in the case of Steichen, these kind of factories of image making, but also its circulation. And Sekula quite nicely points to the fact that in the reflections of the famous American constitutional, Supreme Court Justice and constitutional lawyer Oliver Wendell Holmes, some of the initial imagination of what photography was supposed to do identified it almost wholesale with the circulation of currency. So in his essay, Traffic in Photographs, Sekula moves from this concern with the factory logic of the production of images in Steichen to the kind of monetary or circulatory logic of how the Supreme Court Justice Wendell Holmes thought about the role of the photograph. And part of what underlies this is Sekula's attempt to criticize certain forms of universalism or humanism that attached to the work of photography. And he wants, in a sense, both in the case of Steichen and of Holmes, to think about how the universalism of a kind of monetary abstraction can be linked to the universalism kind of artistic ideas of humanism. And in a sense, the attempt is to work through all of the various ideologies, I suppose, of photography's tasks. So this is what he quotes from Wendell Holmes. I think it's a rather fantastic passage that's worth pausing on for a moment. Partly because it's explicitly about the way in which photography or image making can both dematerialize and, so to speak, circulate. So Oliver Wendell Holmes, quoted by Sekula, writes, "Matter in large masses must always be fixed and dear. Form is cheap and transportable. The time will come when a man who wishes to see any object, natural or artificial, will go to the imperial, national, or city stereographic libraries," kind of nicely quaint in the age of massive digitalization, "and call for its skin or form, as he would for a book at any common library. What's more, and as a means of facilitating the formation of public and private stereographic collections, there must be a range of comprehensive system of exchanges so that there might grow up something like a universal currency of these banknotes. So there's this kind of idea that somehow the photography or image making can be fully laminated onto the idea of a universal and different currency. On promises to pay in solid substance which the sun has engraved for the great bank of nature. So it's this kind of very bizarre, fantastic synthesis between the idea of image making, monetary currency, and natural process that somehow find their apotheosis in the photograph. I had a few more things to say, perhaps about Paglen, but as I've gone on for about an hour, maybe we can have some questions now, and then if we have some more time, then I'll bring that up. If that makes sense, then.
Right.
Yeah.
We have a
Because I don't want
microphone.
to.
We'll try and use the microphone if you're interested in asking a question. I think then we can ask
Yeah.
Hello. Given the irrepresentability of capital, do you have any suggestions as to what kind of aesthetic forms could be used other than the essayistic?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, on one level, far be it for me to have suggestions since I produce no art. But aside from that, no, I think, it's perhaps a good opportunity to clarify that question of representability. On one level, and I think this is a criticism that could be levied not just at Jameson, but at other people who pose this problem of representability. The idea that capital can't be represented is in some sense, could be seen as terribly banal. So at the terribly banal level, if you define, as Marx and others might, capital as a relation rather than a thing, as a process rather than an entity, and as dynamic, contradictory, as a kind of dynamic and contradictory totality, then by definition, you can't represent it in the sense of image it or picture it or capture it. So, and at that level, one could say, okay, well, the problem of the representability of capital might not be, I don't know, at least conceptually or philosophically different than the problem of representing, representing processes, relations, or and so on. So that's at one level. But I think the important dimension, or the important heuristic dimension of what Jameson was arguing, was about, first of all, about the link between representability and collective political experience. So for him, at one point, he kind of has this sort of confession, and he says, oh, well, cognitive capitalism was just this sort of way to sneak in the idea of class consciousness into sort of aesthetic debates about postmodernity, and that is in a sense true, but the problem of representability in politics is also for him a problem of a given historical moment. So his argument was that, yes, on one level, at a purely abstract level, you could say, okay, well, of course, capital is never representable in any banal sense of representable, but in different historical moments there have been, in particular, genres of narrative and representation and visuality, more, so to speak, successful ways of capturing and orienting our understanding of capital. And in his sense, what matters, and that's why the idea that he uses this term from Kevin Lynch, what matters is the sense of what he calls a situational representation. So the idea, in Kevin Lynch's image of the city, the idea of cognitive mapping is really an attempt, it's actually in some sense a kind of quite conservative attempt to build cities in which one can be at home. So the idea is like sprawling cities like Jersey City or whatever are places where cognitive mapping is unsuccessful because they're impossible to orient yourself around, and therefore good city planning involves landmarks and complex topography and differentiated spaces and so on. Now, for Jameson's argument as a historical argument is not to say that when Zola or Balzac were representing capital and class in France in the 19th century, that this was somehow true and non-ideological and a right representation, but it is that it was a coherent and, in a sense, orienting one. His argument about postmodernity is that somehow the nature of multinational financialized capital, because of the intensity of its spatial differentiation and abstraction, means that that link between individual and collective perception and social causes is, in a sense, broken. And actually, that's an argument that he initially makes about empire and colonialism. And so he argues that actually the abstraction of modernism has to be thought of linked to the fact that when, in the so to speak, age of empire, 1817 to 1914, the causes of people's social life are elsewhere. So that colonial exploitation is elsewhere, the real logic of social life is elsewhere, and therefore the aesthetic solutions are ones that are abstract. Now, I think if one looks at, to now get back to your point, if one looks at contemporary visual practices, for want of a better term, I don't think that it's necessarily, I don't think it's necessarily the essay format that is somehow predestined to be the most interesting or satisfactory one. On one level, this is also because, of course, the works that might provide visualizations or representations or thematizations of contemporary capitalism might not, A, say that that's what they're doing, or B, more bluntly, even know that that's what they're doing. And that's, so I guess that's more of a kind of critical question. It's not, I don't think these debates, nor necessarily Jameson's work that he initially presents as a program, are necessarily like prescriptions for producing art that would somehow adequately represent capital. Last point about that is that adequate, the problem is also that if one looks at Jameson's formulation, the representations that are successful are in a sense the ones that make their failure or their impasse or the opacity itself visible or perceivable. And in some way, the worst thing is the representation that thinks it has fully represented capital, because that's in a sense the kind of the ideological representation that treats it as a perfectly seamless, non-contradictory whole. So neoclassical economics has lots of representations of capital, just not ones that he or others might agree with. So, but I don't know. I mean, if you can think of.
I think it's very interesting that the way you've had to move through a certain argument and deal mostly with still images. Even when you're talking about Farocki, you're dealing with still images, and
that was a technical.
Yeah, maybe not because of that. Well, let's say just for argumentative purposes, you walk that particular path. But obviously, what you're doing is you're avoiding, by doing that, you're avoiding the kind of ontological complexity of how montage plays its role in the work of Farocki. And also filmmakers such as Straub Huillet, and how they deal with landscape, which is a very different route.
Very.
And I also think as well, I mean, again, obviously you had to deal in a perfunctory way, in a superficial way. I don't mean that in an insulting way, but in terms of how you had to cover so much material. When you mentioned the 70s, and so you've got something like Goldsmiths in the 70s, and his relationship with landscape and the image, and the imaging of the landscape, and say his text, A Cinematic Utopia, which has got an ontological complexity which really goes beyond this problematic of talking about the landscape and capital just in terms of you know, this kind of indexicality, this idea of, you were saying that Sekula talking about the spiritualization of a particular form of abstraction with the modernist concept of the landscape. I mean, I do actually think that, of course, yes, there is that, but there's a lot more going on as well. There are many complex layers of engagement with abstraction and the landscape, which don't fit into that particular formula that you're dealing with. And a lot of that comes from the moving image and cinema, and yes, Antonioni as well. There's a lot more, but it isn't just a matter of this romantic spiritualization of the landscape in this abstract way that you say, and you know, a much more honest, transparent, indexical relationship with the landscape, which reveals the process of productivity and capitalism. I mean, I do think that obviously there is a lot more going on than that. So in that sense, I just feel that that, you know, because of the fact that you have had to leave out certain issues, such as movement, such as montage, and obviously you touched on Virilio, and Serge Dene would be very important as well in terms of after the Gulf War. He wrote a very famous article in Liberación, which talked about the difference between the image and the visual, where he defined the visual in the same way as Farocki would talk about operational imagery, and where he said the image is the realm of the cinematic, the visual is the realm of what he would call war photography, war images, well, let's say contemporary war photography, not historical war photography, and also military images, advertising, television. He would see that as a visual as opposed to the image. The image was the cinematic. So I'm just maybe thinking about the image, the cinematic, and how that functions in terms of your argument, of course, which is to do with capitalism and the visibility and invisibility of capitalist productivity, but how can you fit this in some way and recognise the complexity of what was going on with abstraction and images of the landscape, including in the 70s, I think, ontologically.
That's a very good question. Just as a point of, yeah, I suppose firstly a point of clarification. I was not by any means trying to make this as an argument about the role of landscape in the aesthetic or artistic production in the 70s. The 70s mention was just to say when the new Topographics took place, and in a way it is an argument, and I wanted to stress that's at least as concerns the Baltz and Sekula, very specific to that debate, and I don't think that debate actually has anything to say about, for instance, Rabelais' use of landscape in their film, in their cinema. So, in a sense, the point was more to try to draw from Sekula's critique, a very, very specific critique of a line, more within photography than within cinema, that I think is definitely the case in work like Burtynsky's and others, which involves this spiritualization of spaces of production, circulation, and so on. Of course, especially as, I mean, partly because Straboyer comes to mind because I had to spend a lot of time subtitling one of their films, so this is much more immediate thing. Say, in this case, the film on Franco Fultini's The Dogs of the Sinai, Fultini Cani. That's a film in which, or that use of landscape is one in which, first of all, the question of time and the time of the image is absolutely crucial, and actually in which I mean, in that case, more evidently, it's not the question of capital, but the question of political memory, which is at stake. So I don't think we would really have anything as such to say about that. Of course, if one wanted to have broader debate about the thematizations or uses of landscape in the 1970s, I think it would be totally totally critical. And of course, the question of, I mean, certainly at least as defines Farocki's work, the question of the specificity of montage in that film essay and film critique form is certainly crucial. And that's why I don't think you can, as in the work of Sekula, I think obviously you can draw a set of theses or arguments that you could translate in a sequential theoretical way, but you would obviously miss out an immense amount from the work itself, which is very different actually, probably because I didn't mention, than the work of Paglen, in which there is this disjunction, in which in fact the text on the geography of security and war and the photographs, the satellite photographs, telephotography work on the secret spaces of the Pentagon, etc., are quite separate. So in some sense,
I think though in Farocki, the relationship between text and image is very complex. And
yes.
Rhythm as well is very important.
Yes.
So, but also as I was saying that, you know, with a lot of the work that you had to mention in passing, I just felt that it was just emerging, maybe not intentionally, in your argument, this repetition of the relationship between opacity and abstraction and you know, the spiritualization of a certain form of abstraction. And I just thought maybe it's a different understanding of abstraction, that there are different forms of abstraction, conceptual abstraction, which can include many forms of complexity, which are just, you know, on that level, I felt.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I was simply wanting to identify the problems that are generated, and this is not with regard to Farocki, but simply in terms of Sekula's critique of the new topographics, the problems that are generated aesthetically by those works, and they are a very limited and particular bunch, those works which thematize space as in a sense concretely or really abstract. But I think that's a very, very specific domain, which again would be quite separate than the work. You know, its relationship, for instance, to the work of Smithson or to you know, various instances of 70s debates around land art and so on. I think that's very. I don't have any straightforward argument about how those two things would connect. I'm not entirely sure they would, other than in a sort of uber generic category of landscape, which is not what I wanted to simply thematize that particular role that the question of abstract space has for that photographic thematization of landscape, if that makes sense. Then the link, in a sense, between between Sekula and Farocki, which I tried to make it more lengthy than the thing that I circulated, is about instrumentality, operationality, and logistics, but not about landscape. So that I went quickly to the fact that it's not, even though landscape was in the title, it's not what covers the passage between those works.
Is this on? Thanks. I wonder if one can make a distinction between the opacity of representations of the landscape in the sense that perhaps they conceal social relations or whatever, and the opacity of landscape itself, although it's difficult to say this obviously because landscape is a kind of representational category, but a kind of withdrawal of landscape from representation or from use, or perhaps even from the human relation, you know, sort of non-human, as it were, dimensional, something like that, in the name of which one might want to actually talk about the capacity of representation, so that the question with certain works of art or cinema would be, how do you prize those two opacities apart? And maybe that is the issue in Strawbrillier. Maybe something of what they're doing is showing some kind of opacity or withdrawal of the landscape from the human in some way.
Yeah, not just a withdrawal, I suppose also a kind of inexorable, not ambivalence is not the right word here, but there's something deeply unsettling, and I think willfully unsettling in Fotini Cani, for instance, about the fact that on a connotative level, because one knows the narrative, one knows and one hears the narrative of these spaces that are the spaces of the massacre of anti-Nazi partisans and so on and so forth. But there are also these spaces of, there are also these experiences for the viewer of this kind of unsettling calm and beauty that happens exactly at the same time, and that plays on, I think the effect and the affective experience of that does play on that opacity, which is also that question of the relationship between the opacity and the invisibility, and the idea that there might or might not be traces, not necessarily of social relations, but also of experiences and traumas and so on. And I think what's the thematizing of opacity in someone like Baltz, the thematizing of opacity is very specific to spaces whose logic, and Baltz actually makes that very explicit in his own writing, whose logic is to eliminate all traces. To have, that's the point. Like in a sense, the point is that you don't know what they're doing inside, and that actually has also complex effects on how they're represented. But I think I think but I think then in that sense the thematization of landscapes that at least are denoted in some way as natural, like the ones of the Tuscan hills in the Strabouillet, is also has very different effects. And then there's a whole other story actually about the very curious relationship of that new topographics tradition as relates to landscape photography in the US Southwest, which is also about erasing other traces. I mean, the beginning, the late 19th century, early 20th century landscape photography in the Southwest is kind of based on the repetition of the repetition or complicity with the dispossession of indigenous inhabitants of the Southwest, who now don't exist and are and have been replaced by the seemingly pristine nature. And so I think there's also interesting historical relationships between that, and there's also interesting relationships between that new topographics photography and someone else who's more closely related to what Paglen does, the work of Richard Mizrach around the nuclear sites in that area, which also plays on this register of aesthetic beauty, a trace that is not necessarily clearly a trace, and that question of opacity.
I think what I'm talking about is the relation or non-relation between, I mean, you're projecting it in terms of relations between different human groups or different historical moments, memory in terms of different historical moments, but I'm thinking also of the relation to the non-human that is implicit in landscape.
Mm-hmm.
The memory of the landscape itself are traces which may be human but maybe are not human. Not to kind of necessarily objectify or fetishize that, but to talk about what the problem is of the relation between that and human relations. So there's an opacity which arises in terms of the human social relations involved in capitalism's relationship to landscape or the representation of landscape, but also a sort of withdrawal from the human involved in representations of landscape. So I'm kind of really asking a question about how does one think the relation between those two levels?
Okay. Well, I can see the question, but I don't think one could. I don't know if I could at least have a general answer about that. I mean, I think so. It would have to be an answer about a particular.
Because that might arise in certain art. I mean, even Smithson, perhaps,
yeah.
certain aspects of land art.
Mm-hmm.
I will talk about them, but I just want to say one more thing as well. Okay, you've got the subject matter of photography, which can be trapped too much by a concept of indexicality. But then you've got the materiality of photography itself as an art form. And obviously, after World War II, there's a concept of the post-atomic photograph. Photography took on a whole new ontological, from trauma almost, which was very much to do with the materiality and specificity of the medium. So a lot of photographers who were taking photographs of the landscape, especially in California, and especially on the nuclear sites, weren't preoccupied just with representing those landscapes. There was a much more ontological investigation going on, I think, to do with it.
Sorry, what do you mean by ontological?
I mean to do with the specificity of the materiality of photography itself on that level. So in other words, yes, they were photographing those landscapes, but I think there was more going on in a sense. There was a very self-reflexive investigation of the medium itself, which was beyond the subject matter. It wasn't just the subject matter. There was something more than that. And that was to do with questioning and investigating the very nature of photography itself. This idea of cameraless photography, this idea of what atomic light from, and people like William de Kooning spoke about that, so did Anthony O'Neill. A lot of it has been said about that and written about that theoretically as well. This idea of post-atomic photography and the cameraless photograph because of the atomic photographs that took place in the materiality after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I think, on that level as well, there's that extra dimension, which is that the photography of that time, and a lot of photography in a sense isn't just photography about the kind of subject matter you're talking about. Yes, it's about that subject matter, but there's also this other dimension, which is to do with the specificity of the medium and questioning and investigating of the materiality of that.
Yes, I'm struck looking at the Ball's photographs of how modest and unpretentious the structures seem, as if in comparison to the commercial landscaping of, say, a state like Ohio, where a mall will be built well outside the outskirts of the city, and expect the city to follow, and the mall itself engages in a form of self-representation that is quite ostentatious, which certainly reveals a great deal about the developers, as much about the developers as the false dwellings seen in retrospect to reveal certain qualities about the people who are not represented, but obviously inhabit those buildings. And I wondered if that aspect of self-representation of these grandiose malls that are entirely self-contained commercial centres, illusions really, function in some new mode of representation, self-representation, that has presented a new problematic for people that would engage with them as a subject.
I don't know if I've ever really thought at length about Megamall. No, for some reason, because of Farocki film, the creators of Shopping World came to mind, which is actually, in that sense, quite curiously, not about. It's not about, in a sense, you never properly see the malls themselves. You see the very peculiar image work and surveillance work and planning work that goes into them. I think there's, I think at least in the new topographics, it's interesting that there is this very willful focus on banality and iteration rather than on the focus that a lot of photography, not just, a lot of representation, not just US, would have on forms of built space that are already their own spectacle, which is of course a very long, and complex history in itself. So I think, I think that's a very different question. I mean, it's curious that Jameson's own formulations about cognitive mapping start, or at least have as their kind of allegory or key experience, that famous, famous disorienting experience of the Westin Bonaventure Hotel in Los Angeles, which is, on one level, its own spectacle, but in another level, it's a complete, the part of the point of its allegorical role is that it engages in what Rem Koolhaas, writing about New York, called the lobotomy, the separation between the outside skin and the inside space of the building, but also a further fragmentation inside the building itself, so that actually there isn't, in that case, then one could wonder about malls and the different periodization of malls in the US. First ones of which I believe are built by what used to be social democratic planners who'd come over from Austria and Germany. So they had a very different idea of these as semi-public spaces. But in terms of something like the Westin Bonaventure, it's interesting that the whole experience, well, the whole thematization of this problem of cognitive mapping comes out of precisely a space that would appear on one level to be its own spectacle or its own representation, but Jameson's gambit is that it isn't, and that somehow is indicative or allegorically points to a broader predicament. But I don't know if that's, but I don't know that much about malls.
I can't see the
Thank you very much, Alberto.